Hi everyone, and welcome to the first video of the neuroanatomy and CNS physiology course. And this video is basically just an introduction. So in this lecture today, we're going to be discussing the beginnings of or the basics of the CNS. So we're going to be talking about the brain and the spinal cord. In the next video, we're going to be talking about meninges, ventricles, and CSF. Okay, so first of all, we're gonna be classifying the brain or showing you guys the divisions of the brain. فأول حاجة البرين عندنا اللي هو الفورbrain, الميدbrain, and the hindbrain. تمام؟ يلا الفورbrain is what we usually think of when we think of a brain. So it's formed of the cerebrum or the cerebral hemispheres, two cerebral hemispheres. معاهم الداينكephalon, which is basically the thalamus and the hypothalamus. While the cerebrum ذاته is, as I said, the cerebral hemisphere is also known as the telencephalon. Since the diencephalon, the telencephalon, okay? And the telencephalon is formed of the frontal, parietal, temporal, and occipital lobes. Okay? يلا بعد ذاك عندنا الميدbrain. والميدbrain هو basically it's part of the brainstem. عندنا تاني الhindbrain, which is الpons والمظلة, which are also part of the brainstem. So ذات ثلاث صوب بنسميهم الbrainstem. And then we have the cerebellum as well. تمام؟ Okay, so next we'll talk about the development or the embryology of this CNS. Basically, in the beginning, عندنا a tube, and the tube has dilations. Okay, so we've got the wall and the cavity, and these cavities end up becoming the parts of the brain. So I had the forebrain, which is also in the embryo known as the prosencephalon, and the prosencephalon هيدينا التلنcephalon, which is again the cerebral hemispheres, and the diencephalon, which is the thalamus and hypothalamus. Then we've got the midbrain, which is the mesencephalon, and the mesencephalon is just going to give us the mesencephalon, which is going to become the midbrain. Then we've got the hindbrain, which is known as the rhombencephalon. The rhombencephalon هيدينا metencephalon ومyelencephalon. الميتنكephalon بيبقى البونس والcerebellum، في حين إنه المyelencephalon بيبقى المظلة. تمام؟ So again, let's go really quickly over it again. عندنا الforebrain, which is the prosencephalon, which will become the telencephalon والdiencephalon. The telencephalon becomes the cerebral hemispheres, while the diencephalon becomes the thalamus and the hypothalamus, and mesencephalon becomes the midbrain. And then the midbrain, which is the mesencephalon, which becomes the midbrain. And then a hindbrain, which is the rhombencephalon, which will become the metencephalon, which is the pons and cerebellum, and would also become a myelencephalon, which will become the medulla. تمام? Okay, next, we're going to be talking about the brain in detail. Okay, so when we talk about the brain itself, we're going to be talking about the external features, and then we're going to be talking about the internal features. So when it comes to the external features, our most important thing is our sulcus. In the sulcus, we're in the gyrus. So a sulcus is basically a fissure, and the gyrus is basically an elevation. تمام? So يعني لو الbrain شكله يعني if we take a look at the brain, you're gonna find, this is very inaccurate, but you're gonna find parts that are outwards and parts that are inwards. دول هنسميهم الsulcus, دول هنسميهم الgyrus. تمام? This is basically the main idea. يلا الsulci, their function is basically to divide between the brain, or to divide between the gyri, and we use them to divide between the lobes of the brain itself. So عندنا a few main sulci that are very important that you should know, اللي هم central sulcus, and a lateral sulcus with parietal occipital sulcus. تمام؟ يلا central sulcus basically بيجي ماشي centrally, and it would divide between the frontal lobe and parietal lobe. عندنا برضو lateral sulcus which would divide between the parietal and the temporal. وآخر حاجة عندنا parieto-occipital sulcus which would divide between the parietal and the occipital. تمام. So basically the four lobes of the brain that we have there, they're divided by sulci. يلا because of the central sulcus هيلاقوكم إن there are gyri that are called the precentral gyrus that are called the precentral gyrus or postcentral gyrus. وهيلاقوكم برضو إنه like you're gonna be hearing about those words a lot. تمام. يلا بس نراجع سريع تاني. قلنا السنترال sulcus دي هنلاقيها هتكون between the frontal and parietal. lateral sulcus هتكون between parietal and temporal. والparieto occipital sulcus ده هيكون between the parietal and occipital. تمام. So هيقسموا لنا اللوبس. Another thing that's very important is إنه lateral sulcus ده below it there's a specific lobe of the a specific lobe اسمها the insula. الانسولا دي بتلاقيكم exactly under the lateral sulcus. And it's just very important to know this important fact. It's very commonly asked about. In a lateral sulcus, below it, what do you find? And the answer is that below it, you'll find the insula. So now we're going to look at the idea again in a picture this time, so you can see it very well. And then I have that central sulcus, just right here, which means in the frontal with the parietal, right? And then a lateral sulcus, right here, which means in the parietal with the temporal. And then a parieto-occipital sulcus, which is here I think, which would divide the parietal with the occipital. تمام? This is basically the idea. And they're very important. You need to note that they are dividing the brain. فيلا عندنا تاني الgyri. See some important ones. Actually, we're going to be talking about them later on. تمام? Okay, when you take a look at the brain from a lateral view, from a medial view, when you take a look at the brain from a medial view, you're going to be seeing a few more important structures. You're going to be seeing the diencephalon. You're going to be seeing the cingulate gyrus. It's important to know it. It's also important to know calcarine sulcus right here. And you're going to be hearing about them in the future. When you do, I just want you to be like familiar with those names. عشان بس ما تكونوا مخلوعين when you hear about it next time. So if you ever hear the word calcarine sulcus, you know it's in the occipital lobe right here. And if you ever hear the word cingulate gyrus, you know it's in the medial surface of the brain, right here, right above the corpus callosum. Corpus callosum, we're going to mention it in the video later on. Okay, so next we're going to be talking about two important areas that you're going to find in the brain, which are Broca's area and Wernicke's area. They're both very important areas that are responsible for language. So in Broca's area, that is the frontal lobe, it's responsible for language production. So when you're trying to speak, الحاجة or the part of the brain that's responsible for this is Broca's area. في حين إنه Wernicke's area قاعد في temporal lobe وهي responsible for language comprehension عشان تفهم الكلام. So if you hear something and you're understanding it by Wernicke's area. تمام؟ An easy way to remember it, I remember in the temporal lobe دي قاعدة بالجنبات where your ears are, right? It's where your ear is. So it would make sense, when you hear something or hear words, it would go to Wernicke's area أول. في حين إنه Broca's قاعدة في front of your frontal lobe, والfrontal lobe is closest to the face, so it's closest to your tongue, or your mouth. So when you're trying to speak something, you're going to be using Broca's area, which is in your frontal. Your mouth is on the front, your ears are on the side, or in your temporal area. Simple as that. Come on. So again, just a quick recap. In the Broca's area, the frontal lobe for language production, and Wernicke's area, the temporal lobe for language comprehension or for understanding. So together, they would work to formulate your language. We're going to be talking about it in the future again. We'll pay attention to that. Okay, so next we're going to be talking about the white matter of the brain. When we're talking about the white matter of the brain, we need to really quickly recap on what it means to say white matter and what it means to say gray matter. So أول حاجة, if you imagine that we have a nerve, any nerve is going to have a cell body of it, and then it's going to have the axon, am I right? So a cell body has the nucleus and all of that, and so this part we call it the gray matter. يلا الأxon of it is myelinated, so it will appear as white. So it would be a white matter. Yeah, in other words, if we say gray matter, we mean a collection of cell bodies. But if we say white matter, it would mean a collection of axons. تمام؟ يعني لما نقول white matter, we're not talking about anything that is functional. يعني it doesn't generate an impulse. It would simply be conducting an impulse. And it's simply axons. تمام؟ طيب, and now we're going to be talking about the types of white matter in the brain. يلا the white matter في البرين عندنا 3 types. وزي ما قلنا إن since it's a white matter, it's an axon, it would be connecting and not generating any impulses. So الfunctions حقته كلها connections. عندنا أول حاجة الcommissural fibers. Commissural fibers الfunction حقته is to connect the corresponding region of 2 hemispheres. يعني حتة في الرايت ونفس الحتة في اللeft. It would connect them. So it would connect corresponding, so the same area in the 2 hemispheres. It would connect between them. So it always connects between the left and the right. And then I projection fibers. Projection fibers are afferent and efferent fibers. So they're fibers that are descending or ascending. So they pass to and from the brainstem to the cortex. So they're either descending from the cortex to the brainstem and spinal cord, or they're ascending from the spinal cord and the brainstem coming up to the brain. So that's all. We're not going to be talking a lot about the projection fibers because they're simply a track اللي هنتكلم عنها in the future. كان عندنا association fibers. Association fibers عندنا هم they basically connect different parts of the same hemisphere. So عكس الcommissural كانوا they connect same lobe on both sides. لكن هنا association is on the same side with different parts. So ممكن مثلا it connects a temporal of the right lobe of the right hemisphere مع parietal of the right hemisphere هذا. You get me? While commissural would connect the temporal on the right hemisphere and the temporal on the left hemisphere. تمام? So أول حاجة هنتكلم عن commissural fibers. And we're going to be talking about quick types of commissural fibers. For example, commissural fibers عندنا أهم واحد فيهم, or the one you guys should be more like you should remember the most, is the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum is the largest commissure in the brain. It has 4 parts, a rostrum, duodenal body, and sphenium, and that's not that important at the moment for your level. So just focus on in the corpus callosum, it's the largest commissure. So it connects between the right and left hemisphere. كان عندنا anterior commissure, which connects the temporal lobe. في posterior commissure. Okay, so let's take a look at the corpus callosum, and it's this whole thing, this whole big white matter that connects between both the medial surface of the right hemisphere or medial surface of the left hemisphere. طيب عندنا ثاني projection fibers. Projection fibers هما they are going from superior to downwards, so ascending or descending. Like, there's some super important structure of white matter for projection fibers, which is called the internal capsule. The internal capsule is basically a compact band or sheet that is a collection of all the nerve fibers. So the important thing about it is that it is a collection of all of the nerve fibers in the body going up or down. يعني if the fibers are in the brain and they're trying to go descending, they would have to go through the internal capsule. And the same thing over all the sensory, before they enter the brain, they would have to go through the internal capsule. يعني it's an area where all of the nerves go through. So it's a very important area, especially if something were to go wrong here, you would be, the damage would be very big. Okay, so عندنا anterior parts of it, anterior limb, duodenal, posterior limb, anterior limb, duodenal, posterior limb, retrolenticular, and sublenticular parts. You just gotta be familiar with them generally, as in later on when we talk about the sensory, sometimes you'd find that they would be specific on where it connects. For example, they tell you specific tract goes through the anterior limb of the internal capsule, just so that you can be familiar with the word. Okay. And the other thing that's very important, which we would be discussing again later on when we talk about the blood supply, is that it's supplied by the lenticular striae artery, which is a branch of the middle cerebral artery. At this level, I'm not going to be talking about too much detail, but just يعني افهموا انه لو كان حصل اي حاجه غلط في الارتري دي او في الميدل cerebral artery، احنا ممكن يحصل لنا complete paralysis, complete loss of sensation in the body. لانه شنو ضربنا الانترنال كابسول، الانترنال كابسول هي الحته جايه فيها فايبرز كلها صح. So it's very important to know the blood supply for the internal capsule for clinical purposes. طيب عندنا ثاني اخر حاجه association fibers. Association fibers احنا قلنا انهم they connect between the two different areas in one hemisphere of the brain. And even a short association fibers, they're all over the brain. They're not anything specific. Even kind of long association fibers. Long association fibers are very important to know. There are a lot of them that you shouldn't be focusing on too many. I would personally say you focus on these two, which is the superior longitudinal fasciculus, which is the largest association fiber. وعندنا برضه الاركيويت fasciculus. تمام. A superior longitudinal fasciculus ده it connects anterior اللي هو الفrontal lobe to the posterior part of the brain اللي هو occipital والtemporal lobe. So it's connecting a lot of lobes. So كده it's important to know. كان عندنا arcuate fasciculus, which is super important because functionally it's the reason why we're speaking. So it connects Broca's area مع Wernicke's area, and we already mentioned قبل إنه Broca's area دي which is responsible for speech generation. So نتكلم. في نفس الوقت إن عندنا Wernicke's which is responsible for understanding language. So it's important إنه عشان نفهم الحاجة ونمشي نتكلمها لازم نستعمل arcuate fasciculus. So it's very important for speech. And later on, you'll meet or like you'll run across types of aphasia اللي هم disorders of speech, and you'll know إنه لو قطعنا arcuate fasciculus أو اتضربت, you wouldn't be able to connect between what you hear and what you say. And yeah. ثاني عندنا other fasciculi اللي هم other ones، عندنا other association fibers اللي هم inferior longitudinal fasciculus، وعندنا الcingulum. Inferior longitudinal fasciculus is from occipital to temporal, and it has a role in visual recognition. Cingulum connects parietal and frontal with parahippocampal and temporal. It's just important that you're going to hear about it in the future, so just like be familiar with it. Right, that basically concludes our discussion about the brain. And next, we're just going to be talking about the spinal cord. Okay, so we're going to be talking about the spinal cord, and the spinal cord. Here we go. So over here, we're going to be discussing the general features of the spinal cord. You know, it begins above the foramen magnum, so it continues with the medulla. تمام? It ends when? It ends at the L1 and L2. في حتة بنسميها الconus medullaris. It also occupies the upper 2/3 parts of the vertebral canal. تمام? So take a look at it really quick. عندنا هنا ده الميدولا، عندنا هنا الspinal cord, the foramen magnum. تمام? So that's where it starts. It ends at the level of L1, L2. في الحتة دي which we call it the conus medullaris. تمام؟ So far when you know. يلا بعد ذاك الspinal cord ذاته it's formed in curvature. يعني it's not straight كده, it's not a straight line. It's formed in the structure of curvatures. الcurvatures ديل في الفيتس بيكون عندنا one curvature which is just C-shape. So the way بيكون عامل كده بس C-shape. While in adults بيكون عندنا 4 curvatures. عندنا curvatures اللي قدام بنسميهم lordosis. عندنا curvatures لورا بنسميهم kyphosis. So if the spinal cord were to look, it would look something like this. Okay, this would be called a lordosis. This would be called a kyphosis, assuming that this is the anterior and this is the posterior. Okay, so if it concaves if it convexes anteriorly, the lordosis. And if it concaves anteriorly, the kyphosis. تمام? So عندنا قلنا إن adults 4 إن cervical lordosis so cervical region هيكون في lordosis إن thoracic kyphosis so في thoracic area بيكون في corpus kyphosis إن lumbar lordosis إن sacral kyphosis so the spinal cord normally would have these 4 specific curvatures. Okay, so another thing about the appearance of the spinal cord is that عندنا segments إننا بنقسم السيجمنت هم 31 segments عندنا 8 cervical 12 thoracic 5 lumbar 5 sacral وواحدة coccygeal. All you gotta do is just know this. تاني في gross appearance ذاته something is very important is that a root of the spinal cord that go out. So the anterior and posterior roots, anterior being motor and posterior being sensory, would go behind or in front of the denticulate ligament. And we're going to be discussing what the denticulate ligament is in the next lecture. And then they join to form a mixed nerve. So when you see the nerve coming out of the spinal cord, it's بتشوفها بتكون mixed, both motor and sensory. However, when it exits the spinal cord, it exits separately. It has a motor من anterior, sensory من posterior. تمام? So exits or enters. Then we've got the spinal nerve. So it leaves, the spinal nerve finally here mixed, it leaves through the intervertebral foramen. And it's very important in the cervical, it exits one above, while in the rest, one below. Why? So basically, if we take a look at the spinal cord, you'll notice in the cervical, 8 cervical segments, although only 7 vertebrae. While in the rest, the number of the segments matches the number of the spinal cord spinal nerves. So الفكرة وين؟ الفكرة إنه في cervical first C1 دي بتمرق تحت C1 تمرق فوق C1. So since this first cervical nerve goes above C1, then لما نوصل ل C8 هيكون C8 مارقة فوق ال7th لما نوصل ل C7 هتكون C7 مارقة فوق ال7th vertebra والتحت دي هتكون فاضية هتمرق واحدة أخيرة اسمها C8 تحت ال7th vertebrae. تمام؟ يعني عشان كده there is an extra one في cervical because it exits one above not one below. في الباقي بننزل من below يعني T1 بتمرق تحت T1 T2 بتمرق تحت T2 T3 بتمرق تحت T3 لكن في cervical بتمرق فوقه. تمام؟ تمام. So as the spinal cord ends at the level of L1 or L2, so you know the spinal cord is going to end at the level of L1 or L2. Lumbar, sacral, and coccygeal nerves travel to lead through the corresponding foramen. Yani, although it ends at L1 and L2, the rest of the nerves have to lead through the corresponding foramen. So they're going to go down and then exit. And that results in a nice formation of nerves without the spinal cord. And we call that the equino or called the equina, which is basically the horse tail. So you can see the picture here. You'll see that the spinal cord ends here, but the nerves of the spinal cord will all travel downwards and then exit through their corresponding foramina. And when that happens, you'll leave this nerve shape, which looks like a horse's tail, and we call it the coda equina. Okay? So I've got the spinal cord enlargements, and the spinal cord enlargements, the cervical enlargement, and the lumbar enlargement. And you need to know in enlargements they happen specifically في areas فيها extra plexus. So for example, in the cervical, and then the brachial plexus. Well, brachial plexus, as you know, or as you may know, it's it's a plexus that supplies the upper limb. It comes from the cervical. ما عندها segment في spinal cord للupper limb. So عشان كده بيحصل enlargement في cervical region عشان the cervical region has to supply both the neck and the brachial plexus. في lumbar, same idea, where the lumbar would have to supply the lower limb through the lumbosacral plexus. So a lumbar بيكون enlarged because it will have to supply both the abdomen في lumbar region and the lower limb في lumbosacral plexus. So that's why those two enlargements happen. Okay, so I'm the factors that support the spinal cord in the vertebral column. زي ما عارفين the spinal cord ده it's shorter than the vertebral column, so why does it not fall off? Or like, why does it not move? How does it stay in its place? So there are four factors that keep it in place, and it's kind of important to know them. It's not, usually it's not an area of questions, but it's still important to mention. So أول حاجة عندنا الفايلم terminal. الفايلم terminal is basically the ending of the meninges, all of them together, would attach to the coccyx. We're going to be talking about meninges in the next video, so we're going to be discussing that, and you'd be able to understand what the phylum terminal is. Next, I'm going to denticulate ligaments, which are basically a thickening of the pia mater. Again, we'll also mention it in the next video. And basically, the denticulate ligament would attach the spinal cord to its place. And in the dura mater is برضو a part of the meninges, and it's attached to the foramen magnum above. So it would force the spinal cord to stay attached to the foramen magnum. Next, in the spinal nerves themselves. So since the spinal nerve is part of the brain, since the spinal nerve is part of the spinal cord, and it exits from each foramen, then it would keep the spinal cord in its place. Make sense? يعني if this is the spinal cord and the spinal nerves exit at these levels from the foramen, then basically the spinal cord wouldn't be able to move that far because these spinal nerves are keeping it in place. So basically these are the factors that support the spinal cord in its place, and they keep it in its place. That's basically all there is about the basic or general features of the spinal cord. And internal features of the spinal cord we'll be discussing in separate when we talk about the tracts and so on.